Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of exponential technologies, business innovation, entrepreneurship, thought leadership, enterprise IT security, neuroscience, philosophy, personal development, and more. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is Bill Murphy, your host of the Red Zone podcast. I love discussing scale. How do you scale your security defenses when it's very difficult to get people to scale? We can get systems to scale, but it's very difficult to get people. And one of the biggest questions I was asked by a very, very large association, a massive association CIO recently is, she said, Bill, do you realize how much this is costing me to secure my system? She goes, it's unbelievable to me that we can't find a solution to security problems. And on the one hand, I thought that was kind of a naive question to ask by her, but at the same time, I could understand the wisdom of it because we do need to approach this problem from a very, very different way. So what I did today is I asked Raj Samani to come on my show. And Raj, he works for McAfee and he's a McAfee Fellow and the chief scientist for McAfee. And I had listened to him at the RSA conference. And so he's at the top of the food chain with McAfee. And I really wanted to see a very, very fascinating speaker of how he thought we could solve enterprise security challenges across the globe. And so the title of this episode and the supporting blog post is, how do you decrypt 29,000 computers? So we get into conversations about family, about security and innovation. We get into a lot of different topics, but this one piece is, how do you decrypt 29,000 plus computers? And this nomoreransom.org is a consortium of industry leadership, which I believe, we talk about the human immune system defense strategy, and we talk about some very innovative tactics, and there's steps being made to have really an industry-wide approach. This one in particular, it's a combination of Interpol and McAfee and a bunch of other security organization leaders across the globe, and how they're giving people the ability and companies the ability to not pay the ransom, don't pay the ransom, and creating a repository of keys and applications that can decrypt data locked by different types of ransomware. What a great option. And so to kind of unlock the digital assets of your business. So certainly there's always the backup approach where we back up our systems and make sure those are solid and our virtual machines can come back online fast. But what about if we just could decrypt? And so this is a really interesting option. But our conversation goes much wider than this. And Raj is a fascinating person. And there's a reason why he is the chief scientist, and he's a McAfee Fellow. And so he is a part of the Information Security European Hall of Fame. He holds a BA with honors and a Master's of Science degree. And he has this unbelievable hunger and drive that has built him from making decisions early in his information technology career to focus on security. And it's similar to my own business. And then when it was founded in 2001, security wasn't as hot as it is today. And it wasn't as all pervasive as a problem in 2001, or as in the mind share of our board of directors in our communities. But now it is. So he made some decisions early and took some risks early. And as we get into how he did that, and we get into learning and the importance of learning and the enthusiasm around learning and how you build key skills for the future. We talk about innovation and integrating security into your innovation protocol. And as I run my CIO innovation group, talking about offense and defensive strategies, if you align defense with your offense, it's actually less costly. We talk about the ROI of trust, and we talk about developing communication skills, and we talk about kids and education. We talk about a real plethora and wide berth of information and fun stories about security and Raj's rise to the levels he's at, and then how we at a macro level affect change across the globe. So, with that, I want to introduce you to my really fun conversation with Raj, Chief Scientist and McAfee Fellow. Thank you. Okay, Raj, well, I am super excited to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, for all our listeners, and I talked to you a little bit about the listener audience before we jumped on, tell us a little bit about how did you get to where you are today? Is this something that you mapped as soon as you got out of university, or like how did you get to where you are at the point you are? Maybe explain a little bit about your role now, and then what was your trajectory? How did you get there?
So the official title now is Chief Scientist, and I've got to be honest, I think it's for me, it's probably the coolest sounding job in the world. To be honest, I didn't even know that Chief Scientist ever existed until, well, certainly not when I was at school. And now, obviously, I've got this wonderful role where actually, I'm helping lead and drive McAfee, who I think I love working here. I get the opportunity to drive this company forward from a technical perspective, from a technical strategy perspective. So, I've kind of got the job of my dreams. I kind of say to my boss, I could do this for free, but I kind of realized that I don't want to do it for free, really. I just say that. So I started actually, well, gosh, it sounds a long time ago, but over 20 years ago. And to be honest, security wasn't really a career path. At the time, it was, you can get into IT, and security itself was more of a hobby. So I obviously began to focus on security really just as a hobby. But, I think as time went on, I kind of became more and more interested in it. And I remember, a number of years into my career, I'd kind of been doing help desk. And, as I was doing this help desk work, I kind of had this decision to make, which was, okay, look, I need to focus on something. I don't want to be a generalist. And everybody at the time was going through, there's the Cisco certification, CCIE, and right. You remember the kind of certification boom, right? Everybody was an MCSE, and everybody was a CCIE, and actually, I didn't have a social life after I finished my masters. I did 34 professional exams because I wanted to be the best, right? I wanted to know everything. I'm kind of like an information whore, people say. But I kind of made this decision, which was, okay, look, there's networking, which is going to make me money, or there's security, which isn't going to make me any money, but I'm going to enjoy it. And I actually still remember the conversation today that I had with my wife, and we were sitting there, and I kind of said, look, this clearly is the two paths, and I need to make a decision. And she just said, what do you want to do? And it was, well, I want to work in security. And at the time I just read Cliff Stoll's The Cuckoo's Egg.
Right.
And that book kind of, like, I think cemented it for me, which was, okay, I'm going to do something I love. I realized that it's kind of not really a career right now, and it's not really seen as that important right now, but this is what I want to do. So I began to read and focus, and I bought myself a Cisco router, and I bought myself, I had licenses for firewalls, and I'd configure stuff in my own bedroom, and I began to kind of really focus on that. So it was a conscious decision, and absolutely a conscious decision to get into this industry.
I love that. And there's many that are listening that remember those days 20 years ago where security was, we knew it was coming, but it wasn't really paid attention to. And it's really interesting you made that decision because it wasn't necessarily the obvious choice then, because you're right. I mean, all the respect was given to the rare CCIE and what number you were and the MCSE track. That was really interesting, kind of the genesis of a lot of the certification tracks and such. But, it's funny that a lot of the guys even today that we hire, if you really ask them, right beside their bed at home is essentially a plethora of different boxes and devices and things that they're breaking and testing in the evening. It really is a big differentiator between the guys that are really, really passionate about this industry and those that are just kind of showing up for a paycheck.
Well, I kind of took it to the extreme. For my honeymoon, I took Bruce Schneier's Applied Cryptography with me. I remember one point I was sitting there reading the book on a sun lounger on my honeymoon, and somebody just turned around, looked at me, and just shook their head like, what are you doing? But I think that's kind of what it takes in some cases. And it sounds quite obsessive, but in this industry, and certainly in security, but certainly in tech, there's just a wealth of information. And of course, this was like what, 20 plus years ago. Now with the advent of social media, now with the advent of every conference under the sun that you could possibly think of, I think it's got to the point whereby there's simply too much information to consume. I mean, I remember back in the day we had those few books, right? There was Bruce Schneier's books, there was books by Ira Winkler, there was Kevin Mitnick's books, but by and large we were talking about a relatively small pool of information. There was the one or two conferences, like in Europe we had InfoSec, and there was maybe one or two industry bodies like the ISSA perhaps. CISSP was just beginning to form, and it was relatively quite small. And now, of course, it's an industry. And I think that's been the interesting kind of change, which is we kind of had this as like a hobby where it was a small community, and now it's a wide industry.
So what made you clearly went into the worm's eye level of security first and networking, and then you kind of came up to a strategy level and to a much different level, but you never lost that appreciation for the tech, the real tech part. But how was that another conscious decision where you're going to elevate yourself to the strategy and kind of side of the fence, or how did that start for you?
If I'm honest, I think it was luck, but I don't think it was luck, if that makes sense. So at the time I was consulting for one of the largest employers in the world, and I was working for the Big Four at the time, and I'd done a piece of work for them, and I sat in front of their CTO and I presented the research and technical findings that we had. And the CTO turned around and said, wow, actually the way that you communicate is really good. I've been looking for a CISO. Do you want the role? And, even before he finished the sentence, I was like, yep, of course I do. And while that sounds like luck, I kind of realized when I was doing pure technical work, I actually had a real phobia about public speaking. I had a real phobia about speaking to the board or speaking even to the IT director. So I began a path of trying to teach myself how to communicate, how to read body language, and actually I can still tell you, but the most scariest moment of my career was at InfoSec, and many years ago, and I had agreed to speak at the conference, and at the time I'd begun to write articles and blogs, so they'd been asking me for some time, and I agreed to do it this one year. And I got to tell you, Bill, I barely slept for 2 weeks. The night before I was in a cold sweat. I mean, I was physically and visibly shaking on stage. But I knew that I had to learn the ability to communicate. I had to learn the ability to be able to stand up and articulate to a broader audience. And so, yes, okay, I got offered this role as CISO, but I think it was, there was a lot of work and actually a lot of fear that I had to overcome in order to be able to communicate.
So I think there's a couple of themes that I'm noticing from you I think it's a great message and a great reminder for myself and others. Is just, so communication is super important. And sometimes I think that's one of the things that they get lost, especially on the technology side, because usually the guys are a little bit more, and the ladies are a little bit more binary. It's the cliche that the tech guys really don't communicate well, but you actually really approached that fear and that discomfort in yourself and really blew through that. And I know you and I were talking about communication earlier, and even with children and such. And so it sounds like you've really kind of changed that whole paradigm and decided you were going to be a great communicator.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it was a conscious decision. I'm quite logical in certain things. I don't like surprises. I don't like to kind of realize that actually I've got some issues which are going to hold me back in my career. And actually, I think back to your point, which is whenever I interview for people, I always sit down and I'll always test their technical skills, but I always try to understand the person. I always try to understand those soft skills, because I feel technical, and I'm going to get destroyed for this, but I always feel that technical skills are overrated. And I'm actually a perfect example of that. I wanted to learn something. I got books. I learned, and I was pretty much a self-starter. And much of what I've done is self-taught. But I think what you can't teach from a book and what you can't learn is the ability to learn, is the enthusiasm, is the aptitude to learn, is somebody that was willing to put themselves out there. And so, whenever I interview, I always give the basic test of technical questions, which is the baseline that we need. But at that point, I try to understand, okay, who is this individual? Are they willing to learn? And do they have that kind of attitude and aptitude that really what we're looking for? And so, I think that's probably a key piece of advice that I give certainly to my kids all of the time, which is, and I remember once my daughter said to me the other day, she said, "Daddy, I want Minecraft. Can you buy me Minecraft off the App Store?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Oh, why not?" And I said, "Well, because I believe that if I buy you Minecraft, you're going to constantly and consistently ignore your homework." And she's like 10 years old, right? And so she looks at me and she goes, "Oh, okay." And I went, "Well, hang on, you're just going to walk away and say, okay, you're going to accept the fact I said no." And she went, "Oh, what do you mean?" And I said, "Well, why don't you develop a case for me to try to change my mind?" And so I'm kind of trying to teach my kids this as well, which is don't take no for an answer. Try to understand where the other person's coming from and develop an argument which can help you win your case. And so it sounds like really extreme parenting, but I'm trying to live it every day.
I don't think it is extreme. I think it's necessary because the developing grit, you dove deeply and, read 400 books and you bought equipment, had it in your basement, and it was a different day. But the reality is that can be done today. And that's the type of determination and effort it takes to master a discipline, whether it's computers or whether it's painting, or there's a grit, there's a determination. And so I just got out of an innovation conference through Singularity University in California last week. And one of the key things is the ability not the ability to learn, but how you learn, your unique learning style. And are you hungry to learn? Because the knowledge that we can't depend on our college educations anymore or high school. We've got to be always on learning. But the thing is that everybody has a different gear for learning. Are they really interested in learning, or do they have to have information given to them because they're passive? And it's really interesting. And in security, what's interesting, I met with a very large association in DC the other day, and the CIO, we were talking about innovation and our innovation labs, and then it bridged over to security. And she goes, "Doesn't it bother you that the industry hasn't got together and the world governments haven't got together to solve this problem?" She looked at me and she goes, "Do you realize how much it's costing me to just chase all these security threats?" She goes, "Do you realize how many small businesses are going out of business due to ransomware?" And I looked at her and I have my own thesis around it and such. But the reality is, how many of us are actually approaching this actually to solve the damn problem versus just creating something for someone else to buy? It was a really interesting point. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we are. I can sit down and point to you multiple examples whereby, people have left their egos at the door and are actually doing something to address and tackle this problem. And one of the examples I'll give is, a project that actually I was, co-founded with through McAfee, but actually we had Kaspersky Lab, we had the Dutch police, we had Europol, and we had Amazon Web Services and Barracuda. We kind of got together actually just over a year ago, and we said, okay, this issue of ransomware, it's getting ridiculous. What can we do about it? So whenever we do work like take down bad guys, when it comes to ransomware, sometimes we get the keys that allow people to unlock their data. So we said, well, why don't we just pool our resources? Why don't we put all of the tools in one site and create a single repository where anybody freely, you don't even need to give us your email address. You can go to this site and we will give you the tools to decrypt data, assuming, of course, it's a variant that we know about. And that was just over a year ago. And we started off with, there was 6 of us. Now we're in excess of 100 partners with law enforcement from pretty much most countries all across the world. We've got, a huge number of private sector companies now. Websites translated into 27 languages. The official figure is we've prevented $8.5 million US going into the hands of criminals because we've decrypted 29,000 computers. The unofficial figure is way higher than that. It's just that some of the tools don't actually track how successful they've been in the past. So, and this has cost industry nothing. This is provided free of charge. I couldn't even tell you who we've decrypted because we just give it away free of charge. And so there are examples, and we can sit down and complain and moan and say, well, things aren't where they are or the way they should be. Or we can just stop moaning. We can get up and we can do something about it. And I think, No More Ransom to me is a shining example whereby we just put all of the commercial pressures to one side and did something. And I remember we were trying to recruit a year ago and I had companies and people say no to me. And then 6 months later, some people came back and said, oh, actually, yeah, we will join now.
When I heard you speak at RSA, is that the No More Ransom? Is that the organization that you're referring to?
Yeah, so the website is nomoreransom.org, and you don't need to be a McAfee customer. You don't even need to have antivirus. And you can go to this site, and if you've been impacted by ransomware, we'll tell you the variant that you've been hit by. And if we have a free tool that can allow you to be able to decrypt your data, you don't need to give us your email address. You don't need to have the salesperson won't call you afterwards. We don't track anything. It's just free to access. And we've also got the ability for you to be able to report the crime back to your local law enforcement as well.
I love that. And so how many people or how many companies are involved in this? Would you call it a consortium, or would you call it a loosely coupled confederation? Like, what would be the right word to call it?
So you remember Lord of the Rings, and I think it was the first film. And I think I did this analogy actually a few times, but it's the analogy of Lord of the Rings, right? So Gandalf and the Fellowship are crossing the bridge, and they're being chased by, I think it was a dragon or some equally nasty thing. And Gandalf says, you go ahead, and he stops at the bridge. He puts his staff down. He says, "You shall not pass." And this is what this is. This is a "you shall not pass" moment. This was like with WannaCry, for example. In the UK, 8,000 operations were impacted. Like, medical procedures were not carried out because of, actually, I don't think it was ransomware, but because of something labeled as ransomware. And that's the impact that it's having. People are not getting operations. Companies are going out of business. Large companies are actually having decrease in revenue, like, quarter upon quarter results. So this really was that "you shall not pass" moment. We've got to do something about this, because, look, if we as the industry with law enforcement can't do something about it, who is? This is our job. This is what we do. This is what we're really good at. So why don't we do something about it?
Yes, I love it. I think it's fantastic. I'm so glad you shared that with the audience, because I think people don't know how to combat this, and they don't know how to take action. And this is definitely stepping forward and giving someone a chance to actually bypass paying the ransom and actually looking and see what they can do about it.
Well, right now, if you're hit by ransomware, you have two options: pay criminals or lose your data. That's really not a great set of choices. So we kind of try to give people a third option, which is do neither. Get your data back and don't pay criminals. To me, that's probably, I think, the greatest success is we are directly impacting the revenue earned by criminals. And that's what I'm particularly proud of.
It seems like this was an I call this an innovation. So I think, actually, it's probably more of a transformation. I've been having this conversation with people. What does it really mean to be innovative? And painting a tree that's green, painting it green and orange, and calling it something innovative it might be different, but it's certainly not innovative. But it seems like this is a transformation that the industry really needed. And also, I look at your role at one of the organizations on your LinkedIn profile. You actually had innovation next to it. So is this something that you really think actively about, is how you innovate and how McAfee innovates, how you innovate, or how you bring in innovative ideas to the marketplace? Do you actually think about that from a transformation point of view?
We've heard the saying that security is an enabler. And yet the reality is most people listening to your podcast couldn't give you an ROI for any of the security technology they've ever bought. It's quite embarrassing, I think, to an extent, because you buy this technology and you buy it because you know that if you don't, there might be an issue, or you may be on the news, or, and it's always ifs and whens and maybes. And so my biggest challenge today is, how can I actually demonstrate and articulate that security, or not even security, that trust is an enabler for businesses across the world? And I firmly believe that, because the reality is I'm not a security person. None of us are. There is no such thing as cybersecurity. It's a made-up word. We are technologists. All of us are technologists. What we try to do is we try to manage and mitigate the risks that the innovation is clearly going to have. So, I'll give you an example. it was a few years back, and I was out in the Middle East, and I met with an oil company, and we were talking about the evolution of oil and gas. And one of the things that we discussed was this feasibility of developing what we call a digital oil field. Now, of course, what that means is that they're going to move away from a manual environment to a fully automated digital systems. And because of the work that we did, we were able to increase oil production from 400,000 barrels to 1 million barrels a day. Now, that clearly introduced huge numbers of risks, right? Because you're now putting digital systems in which can manage, equipment out in the middle of the Arabian Sea. But what we did was we actually considered what the risks were, and we put in as many controls as we could possibly find to try to ensure that disruption doesn't happen. And that to me is probably my favorite use case, because what it says to any business across the world is, as an industry, we can revolutionize the way that you work. And just because it introduces new risks doesn't mean that you should just ignore it. Actually, what we should do is, from a trust perspective, we should look at ways to manage or at least reduce the risk to a level that we're comfortable with. And that's kind of, I guess, really the charter that I'm trying to do here within McAfee and with some of our partners and customers that we work with, which is, okay, look, this is the way that your business works. How can we revolutionize the way that you operate and use technology such that you can have 250% productivity gains, as we saw in oil and gas?
Are you or McAfee kind of spending time educating technology leaders, CIOs, and CISOs about basically how to convert what their spend is into this is communication, and this is communication in a different way. So how are you educating about how the dialogue needs to shift?
So in many cases, when organizations do something so disruptive for an industry or for a specific vertical, invariably it kind of involves their senior leaders. For example, I wrote a book around smart grids, applied cybersecurity in the smart grid. And I actually talk about this model whereby utilities don't make money through electricity. They make money through becoming a data broker. And tongue in cheek, I say, the company that provides you electricity in the home will have more data than Facebook in 2 to 3 years' time. It actually is kind of true. So what it takes to get organizations to adopt these disruptive technologies, in many ways, it really depends upon the leadership within that company. And then, of course, you're going to get other companies who are going to say, well, actually, you know what? I don't feel comfortable being the kind of organization that's going to do something this dramatic. What we'll do is we'll wait and see what happens. And so, in many cases, you'll find within industry, you'll find those companies that will be disruptive, that will do things, and that will be first out. And then you'll find that other companies, like competitors, will kind of follow as well. And we've certainly seen that. I mean, when we developed this digital oil field, I remember I was talking at a conference about this, and I was actually told, "You're crazy. You would never do this. Why would you have this type of connectivity? It's dangerous. It's risky." And then 3 years or 2 years after we rolled it out, there was a digital oil field conference. And interestingly enough, they didn't invite me. And I remember getting the phone call and they said, "Oh, would you like to come to this digital oil field conference?" And I went, "Oh, yeah, that would be great." And I said, "Well, okay, that's going to cost you this much money to speak." And I went, "Yeah, thanks very much. Good luck." But I think, that's kind of what it takes. You'll have some organizations who are more than willing to kind of try something and do something like this. And equally, you'll be other organizations that may well follow. And actually, I'm quite fortunate that a lot of the people that I work with are kind of that visionaries in their own field, and they kind of come to me and say, "Well, actually, can we do something, and how can we manage these risks?"
So I have a vision for security. I want to see how you respond to it, because I think that ultimately security is going to follow a biological model that, and many of my listeners have heard me say this before, where if an ecosystem is disrupted by an invasive species or an oil spill or something that happens, normally humans apply a patch and then nature has to take over and heal. And that could be a wound on our body. It could be a cut, a sprain, a broken body. We splint it, or we put a patch or Band-Aid, and then the body takes over. So I really think ultimately, whether it's a 0 to 5, 0 to 10, 0 to 50, is that we're going to have self-healing. We have these outbreaks, viruses, malware, infestation, whatever it may be, and then there's going to be maybe a human patch, but then there's going to be a self-healing that takes over. Now, I don't know how that's going to work out with FBI and law enforcement and Interpol and UK and vendors and individual devices and such, but that's the vision I'm holding too. And what do you think about that? And is there a macro vision upon that we should be thinking about, or where do you see this ultimately going in the 0 to 1, 0 to 5, 0 to 10 year time frame?
Well, so actually, interestingly enough, this concept of self-healing networks is something that, actually in some cases we've actually got proof of concepts in place. If it's a known, so for example, if it's a threat that we know about, a network should be able to respond and recover from that. And that's kind of in proof of concept phase. But, for me, I think it's broader because we talk about security as a separate discipline. In fact, even the word cyber is a separate discipline. You take the word crime and you put cyber at the end of it. You put the word war, you have cyber war, cyber attacks, and heck, even cyber sex. And actually, all they are is just an evolution of crime, an evolution of warfare, an evolution of, well, actually, I don't know if it's an evolution of sex or not, but but I don't know if it satisfies the same, but I wouldn't know. But again, we kind of look at this as a separate discipline, and yet within 3 to 5 years' time, Bill, you're going to be sitting in a car doing 70 miles down the freeway, and you're going to be sitting and talking to your children, and the car's going to be driving itself.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is, and in fact, just yesterday we saw, vulnerabilities in cardiac equipment, or we've had vulnerabilities in insulin pumps, and like our dependency on technology is becoming almost ubiquitous. And WannaCry was a great example of that, which was a vulnerability which hadn't been patched, that was available for months before, caused wide-scale disruption, and I genuinely believe actually WannaCry was, or certainly NotPetya was, intended to disrupt anyway. So I genuinely feel that right now we're kind of in this halfway house, which is security still isn't at the top table. How many CISOs do you know that are on the board? I don't know one today. And yet every organization today is dependent upon technology to the extent that if they had a significant outage, it could be the death knell of a company. So I genuinely feel that right now security as an industry maybe isn't important enough, and maybe that's the job that we've got to begin to do. We've got to begin to be able to have that seat at the top table, so that security is designed from the ground up, so that when you and I buy things from Amazon or wherever we buy these IoT equipment, that they have security and privacy built in. It's ridiculous that companies like VTech can edit the privacy policy so they say that if your children's personal data is compromised, we're not held liable. And yet they can say that and they think people will get away with it, and people still continue to buy. So, I think generally as a society, we need to be able to value our data more, and we just simply don't. I mean, I've seen people give away their personal data for a bar of chocolate, and I see people giving away their data for nothing more than a bar of chocolate, and yet companies like WhatsApp are being acquired at billions of dollars, and they're being acquired for personal data. So the perceived value of data is rock bottom, and the actual value of data is relatively high. And I don't think this model is going to continue for long.
I agree with you, and I think partially the CISO. Well, I think in many of the companies I work with, the CIO is still the CISO, even though they might have a CISO or a administrative staff or VPs or directors are playing a security function. It is still the minority of companies that actually have the CISO that's reporting into the board or reporting into the audit committee or what have you. It's becoming very, very expensive for companies to staff security operations the way maybe some of the Fortune 100 or Fortune 200 companies can. But I do like the ability for people to learn that are listening on, can you give me an ROI in security? And I love that question you had, and using security as a trust enabler and starting to change the conversation. So you're having a much different communication about security, of how you can enable it as to play a part of the offense of your organization.
Well, as a consumer, I want to know that the CISO for every single organization has been involved with innovation. That to me is what I want as a consumer, because I know that the CISO is going to say, well, okay, have we considered the security risks and have we managed them? Have we considered the privacy issues associated with this device? And today, I don't believe the CISO, and not in all cases, but generally speaking, when an organization innovates, the CISO is contacted on a Friday. I mean, I remember I used to be a CISO myself, and I remember getting a phone call at 4:30 saying, "Oh, well, actually, we've developed this new system, and on Monday we're going to go live. We just forgot to send it to you. Can you please sign it off?"
Oh, jeez.
And I'm sure there are your listeners here. Yeah, and I'm sure there are people listening to this podcast now that will nod their head and say yes. In fact, I'm sure there's probably one or two people listening right now on a Friday maybe, and their phone is ringing and they're thinking to themselves, "Oh my good God, is that the same call that's happening?" So we need to be part of the business. The security team is a part of the business, and actually, I would say, when it comes to trust in the digital world, we're more important than ever. I mean, Poneman talk about this thing called the abnormal churn rate, which is if a company is breached, then an organization can expect to lose between 2 to 5% of their customers because of the loss of trust. Well, actually, that was 2 to 5% ages ago. When TalkTalk were hit, it was reported they lost 90,000 customers. When DNS were hit, and they did their due diligence, by the way, by Mirai, they lost way more than 2 to 5%. And so I think the concept of trust in the digital age is not understood as well. And maybe that's something that we as an industry need to do, which is we need to join the grown-ups table. We need to be able to articulate the value that we bring to the business. And more importantly, we need to bring innovation into the company so that when the company does innovate, the consumers aren't going to be having issues whereby personal data is taken through the back door, which is what's happening now.
Yeah, and I think there is a way for companies to defense innovation within security, or I like to say defense, to be able to move that. It's got to move at the pace of the offense of the business, and I think that's a challenge for security, is to be able to move at speed and to be able to adjust at speed because of kind of the accelerating way in which companies have to test new applications, test like nobody's really spending multiple millions of these framework projects. They're using more iterative designs and such. And so like security has to really adjust with that. And that is quite a challenge for most security operations to do.
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge, which is when it comes to innovation, when it comes to these emerging new business models, a company feels it has to move as quickly as possible. And the misconception that they have is that the security team may slow them down. But quite frankly, doing due diligence is a fundamental requirement. Is a legal and a regulatory requirement when it comes to handling customer data. I just wrote a blog today where my music system, the company that provides music into my home, have updated their privacy policy. And what they said was, we are now going to capture personal data from your house. Oh, and by the way, if you don't like that, your device will stop working. I mean, that's the world that we're living in, is that organizations are now, to me, that's unethical, by the way, but changing the privacy policies. But that's the world that we live in, is that you have companies today making decisions about data about you, me, my children. And to me, that's unethical. And so I don't believe for a second that a CISO, or certainly any good CISO, would have said that's a good thing to do. And so we're seeing this happen time and time again, where pacemakers are coming out with vulnerabilities, or cars can be remote controlled and so forth. And so having the CISO as part of this innovation, I think, is not only good for the business, but quite frankly, is good for us as society.
I agree. As we wrap up, I'd love for the decision makers that are listening to be able to understand where to go to learn more about McAfee and learn more about. So we've had some really interesting conversation about a wide variety of subjects, and McAfee is clearly a world leader in these areas. Is there a place that people can go to start learning about where the most appropriate tools, technologies, and approaches that McAfee is deploying now? And I can put this on my show notes as well. This goes up. My team puts this on our show notes page. And so people don't necessarily have to memorize all the URLs and products. We'll definitely put them up there for people. But where would someone start if they really wanted to kind of dive into the thesis more of where McAfee is going?
So I think this is the most difficult question that this is my biggest challenge, which is we do all of this work, we'll take down bad guys or we'll create free decryption tools. How do we get the information to people? Now, of course, there's McAfee.com, right? There's the website. But quite frankly, how do you stay up to date with data and information? We're using social media like LinkedIn, and we're using Twitter. So, the website's a great place to start, but to stay up to speed with all of the latest information, we've got multiple channels. We've got McAfee Business, McAfee Gov, and dependent upon what area you're interested in, you can follow the key accounts or join the right groups. And of course, I'm on Twitter, so I'll post stuff as well regularly also.
Okay, so basically, whatever their platform of choice to receive information, whether it's LinkedIn or McAfee.com or follow Twitter, and then he can follow you. Would it be a good place to reach out to you? What do you prefer, Twitter, LinkedIn? What's your preference?
Twitter or LinkedIn is fine, but just mention on the podcast if you're sending a LinkedIn, because I generally decline if I don't know people, which I think is good practice. But if you mention the podcast, then at least I know that you've listened to this. At least I guess.
Yes, I mean if you get several thousand, it's probably Twitter. Most of my guests default to Twitter for sure, and I'll put your Twitter handle up there so they can follow you. So is there any parting words of wisdom that you wanted to share with my audience before we go today?
I've got a number of children. Actually, I've got 3 children. I was going to say a number of children, and then my wife was going to go, really? Is this something you're not telling me? No, I've got 3 children, and I'll be honest, I'm really quite nervous about the future. And this is not meant to kind of sound melodramatic or anything like that, but a lot of what I talk about is, we look at vulnerabilities, but these vulnerabilities and devices that our lives depend upon. And so one of the challenges that I think we have today is we need to get more individuals and children and really interested in this career. And I would urge every single one of your readers, and to your listeners, please do everything that you can to just talk to your kids about the value of personal data, but also more importantly, show them the career opportunities that exist here in this industry. Because, I speak at a school once a month. That's something I always try to do. I always try to speak at a school a month. And every single time, and I remember I went to a careers day just recently, and when I was there, they had a careers day and they had community support officer, so that was law enforcement. They had army recruitment, and they had a local, what we call a solicitor. So it's somebody that would do conveyancing for homes and stuff. And I turned around and I remember saying, like, these were the same people that came to my careers day like 25 years ago. And it just staggers me that, everything that we do is focused upon technology, is dependent upon technology, and yet we're still showing children that. We're not showing children or inspiring children about what the career opportunities here are. So I guess my ask is this, which is talk to your children about cybersecurity, talk to your children about cyberbullying, tell them about the career opportunities that exist, and please do everything that you can to promote things like no more ransom, and tell people not to pay, because we work in technology, but those that won't know where to go. And so all of us should be ambassadors towards getting more people into this industry, taking security seriously and our privacy seriously, and managing our personal data as well.
I think that's a great message. And I just had a personal story with and I think I might have shared this, but I don't think I have with my audience, that my kids were coming back to me a little while ago saying, "Man, Dad, you're such a geek." And my 3 kids, neither one of them is inclined to be breaking down computers and tearing them apart. And they're just not inclined that way necessarily. However, when we started talking about autonomous vehicles at the kitchen table, and so they're learning certain things at school, they're thinking that's like a real nerd thing to do, is tuning AI LiDAR systems on cars, and then that's where society, that's the value. And I said, well, hold on. I said the programmer's not tuning the choice of whether to hit the child that's walking across the in front of that car, or swerve over to the sidewalk and hit the 4 people that are walking along the sidewalk. Like, who makes the decision that car will veer into the sidewalk to hit the 4 or just hit the 1? Like, that's an ethical, that's a moral, that's a philosophical question. And so why can't they go into that side of the conversation? Why can't they go into the legal side of the question? Because some attorney's going to have to get involved, or the code review side, or certainly there's the programmatic side. So I think there's a certain there's a certain education around what's available for participation in this conversation about data and data privacy and the like.
But I think, that's what's so exciting about what we do, because every single facet of society is evolving and changing. I mean, the way that we communicate has stood still for in excess of 2,000 years. And in the last 20, it's changed. Right. So the way that you used to develop social networks, for example, was based upon this concept of physical proximity. In other words, I knew my next door neighbor, I knew their neighbor, I knew the person down the street, I knew the butcher, the baker, and so forth. Now, your friends, you've probably never physically met. If you went to a conference and the person that you'd been communicating with for 5 years over email, you may not even recognize them as sitting right next to you. So we've built, the way that we communicate and the way that we've built networks together and develop friendships is now based upon, common interests. The way that how we communicate has changed, how we work has changed, how we travel has changed. Like technology has revolutionized every single part of us completely as a race. We've had more changes in the last 20 years than we have in 2000. And the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to be faced with some of the most moral and ethical challenges that we've ever really experienced. I mean, you touched upon that, which is at some point you say that a car is going to have to make a decision. Does it run over one person to save potentially many, or does it protect the person behind it? Well, actually, that's going to be based upon the code that's written in the application. So who's going to be the person that's going to be developing that? Who's going to be the person developing the logic? Even more mundane things like, well, okay, if my credit card is cloned, will the bank refund me? Well, at what point does the bank say no? Or if my car is hacked by ransomware, then do I lose my car? Or will the auto company be responsible for preventing ransomware onto that? And all of these fundamental issues, these that we haven't really got under the skin of, actually we put under the bucket of security. And that's what I'm saying. I think the term security we have to do away with that, because fundamentally the work that we do has far-ranging consequences way beyond just simply installing antivirus.
No, their dependence is huge, and I don't know. It's an interesting question, like how the nuclear industry actually made decisions on how everything gets backed up. Like when you have a meltdown of a reactor, and some of the actual supporting systems that go into backing up, essentially preventing a major catastrophe to happen. Because if you look at that from how we've engineered complexity and backups into some of our more complex systems, planes and all sorts of medical operating rooms, hospitals. They're very complex, and that we've engineered the best we can into providing some resiliency within those systems. But for example, if a nuclear warhead goes off in the atmosphere and knocks out all of our GPS communications, that impacts everything from our gas stations turning on to our autonomous vehicles. There's a wide-ranging impact. So that would drive decisions of how we build resiliency into the local fabric of society. So it's quite interesting, these conversations, Raj, and I am really excited you came on the show today, and I hope we can do a round 2 in the future sometime.
I look forward to it.
Well, thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.